It's been a really crazy week for me right now. Not in a bad way. There's been good stuff about this week, but in my personal life, I have been all over the place pretty busy with some stuff this week. As at the time of this filming of this video, which today is April 21st, it won't be up on April 21st, but still, the video I did on my favorite games of 95 to 99 just went up yesterday, and that video had been sitting on my computer for several days before being uploaded, and I had filmed it maybe like 2 weeks ago or something like that, right when I filmed the video I did on Brockhampton's puppy. I meant to get it out way sooner, but again, this week I got totally busy, had so much going on in my personal life. Good things again, but wow, I just did not expect time to get away from me in the way that it did. But now, finally, I'm able to film the next video in the series. It feels like it's been so long since I got to film something in this series, only because it's been a couple weeks. And yeah, you can see it in the title, by the way, and I mentioned this at the end of the last video, but from this point forward, in this particular set of I Want to Talk About videos, I'm only going to be talking about games in individual years. We're not going to be doing the whole eras thing where I talk about a set of years. From this point forward, no matter if the year is jam-packed or has almost nothing to talk about, it's going to be an individual year. It's just easier that way than trying to combine years of the 2000s. And of course the 2010s and 2020s when we get to those. Just wanted to get that out there, but now we can finally get into the video itself. Welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And as you can tell from the title today, I want to talk about I want to stutter. That's what I want to do. I want to totally lose track of what I was trying to say and then just come through with some gibberish. Sorry about that. As you can tell from the title today, I want to talk about my favorite games of 2000. The year 2000. Not the entire decade, just the year 2000. Again, you know how this video goes. I introduce the year, I get into some big games from the year that I didn't play, some games that just missed the cut of my two lists, the first of them being the cream before the crop, which are the games that I gave an 8 or 9 out of 10 to, and then my proper best list of games that are personal 10 out of 10s to me. Again, you know how this goes at this point. There's been 3 or 4 videos in this series already, so it's 4. It was 4. Damn it, it's 4. I'm losing count. Let's get into the video. So, 2000. Looking back on 2000 as a year in gaming, it was a pretty slow one from my research. As far as the world, I mean, yeah, everyone survived. Y2K turned out to be nothing but a bunch of boosh. But as far as gaming, looking back, it was a little bit slow. You might see the intro of this video go on for a little long because the list of games I really enjoyed in 2000 is pretty small. There's only one proper 10 out of 10 game on my actual best of list, and even the cream before the crop list of 8s and 9s only has 2 games. So that's really only 3 games that I truly loved from the year 2000. Again, I know I could have combined this year with other years of the 2000s, but the next few years of the 2000s are much more packed to the point where it just didn't make sense to me. I also acknowledge that I technically could have waited to talk about Rayman 2: The Great Escape until this video because I played the Dreamcast version, which came out in 2000, but I talked about it with the 90s games because the other versions came out in the 90s. Might be. But there's still interesting things to talk about as far as where the industry was, and for these intros, instead of talking about the massive evolutions of the industry, because we're not talking about eras anymore, I'll probably just spend the intros talking about how each console manufacturer was doing, and all that good stuff, and if there were some other notable events worth talking about in a given year. So in 2000, there were still 3 notable players in the console market. It was Nintendo, Sega, and Sony. And Nintendo was putting out a stream of notable titles on the Nintendo 64 at the time, but just not enough of them. Looking back, there were games coming out on something of a monthly basis as far as first-party titles, and some pretty decent ones at that, but there were quite a few dry spells as well, and even some of the big first-party titles that were coming out were not exactly, like, up to the high standard that Nintendo typically places on itself. And while Nintendo was killing it sales-wise in the handheld market, they had just sold their 100 millionth Game Boy or Game Boy Color, the N64 sales were plummeting, and Nintendo was finding it hard to move N64s off of shelves at that point. Granted, people probably knew that Nintendo was getting ready to transition to the next console generation, but even still, people were not really buying N64s in droves. And yeah, the PlayStation sales fell in 2000 compared to 1999, but it still managed to sell a pretty healthy amount, and well, it also had an excuse for its sales dropping, but we'll get to that later. But being completely fair, even if Nintendo was struggling a little bit to push Nintendo 64s off of shelves, at least they weren't Sega. I mentioned at the end of the last video that the Dreamcast came out in 1999, and in 2000, it pretty much had its first full year on the market, ushering in the 6th generation of gaming. And while numbers-wise it may have sold a little bit better than the N64 did, Sega was barely able to pay people to buy a Dreamcast. All things considered, they were building a pretty impressive library of games, specifically on the first-party front, and the console had features that were well ahead of its time, some of which I outlined in the last video, but very little was able to go right for the console on the commercial front. Sega had already created such a stain on its name with the consecutive failures of the Sega CD, the 32X, and the Sega Saturn, that it would have probably taken a miracle for the Dreamcast to win back the gamers, no matter if it was a good or bad console. And it would have taken a lot to win back the jaded third-party developers that had moved to the PlayStation. Most notably, the two third-party publishers that they were missing out on the most back in that day were EA and Squaresoft, who were pretty much the biggest third-party publishers in America and Japan, respectively. Obviously, losing those big players meant you were kind of going to be fucked in both markets, and those two were clearly doing much bigger things for the PlayStation. So despite being an impressive console at the time, the Dreamcast felt like a relic that just couldn't keep up with the changing tides of the gaming industry. Impressive as it was that this thing could play pixel-perfect ports of arcade games, gamers simply weren't interested in that arcade style of gaming anymore. Bigger things were possible, and suddenly that arcade style just didn't seem all that cool at the time. That era started to feel a little bit bygone, so to speak. And while the Dreamcast was kind of great in how it didn't conform to what game consoles were becoming, the weight of commercialism made it so that such a console would not be a feasible success on the market. So Sega was largely feeling the burn of that. And ultimately, that's why 2000 was probably not the best year for them. But there was one massive thing that happened in the gaming industry in the year 2000, something that many feel led to the death of the Dreamcast, though I find that kind of debatable. Obviously, in this series, we will talk about new console releases as they happen, and in 2000, we got the release of the PlayStation 2. This thing came in on a massive wave of hype, and quite frankly, why not? I mean, the PlayStation 1 was a huge revolution, and it pretty much managed to beat Nintendo in something of a curb stomp as far as sales. Since Nintendo came in and revitalized the gaming market after the crash in 1983, they were not exactly uncontested on the market, but it seemed like they were always finding a way to beat the competition. Even when it seemed like Sega had taken the lead, Nintendo found a way back. But the PlayStation was the first console to really put Nintendo in its place. So with how incredibly popular it was, of course the PS2 was going to be incredibly highly touted, and of course it would go on to become the highest selling video game console, though we'll see in due time if the Switch can pass that. And yeah, it became an icon of gaming. I would even say it's one of my favorite consoles. The PlayStation 1 and 2 were actually my first big consoles, and I'm even wearing a PlayStation shirt because, obviously, I have grown up with PlayStation. Though oddly enough, I'm not really going to be talking about many big PlayStation 2 games in this video because looking at its launch lineup, which was admittedly pretty massive, you can see it on screen here, and I know there's a lot of games here. You can pause to see what came out at launch if you want. There wasn't really much in the launch lineup that I personally played, and if I did play any of these games, it was just like for a little bit of time. Hell, I know it's still a pretty heavily debated topic whether or not the PS2's launch lineup was actually good or not. And sure, that's a matter of personal taste and preference and what you like as a gamer, of course. But looking back at it, it felt like a lineup that was huge, but didn't necessarily have a ton of standouts. When you think back to a lot of the best games and the most memorable games and the most beloved games on the PS2, not many of them came out at launch. It would take about a year or so for the PS2 to get those big blockbuster games, which admittedly is a natural thing. There have been a lot of PlayStation consoles that, in my opinion, have had kind of weak launch lineups, and not just PlayStation consoles. In general, launch lineups can be a little bit iffy here and there. But obviously first impressions are important, and I know some people might think, how in the hell did the PS2 manage to succeed as hard as it did if gamers had to play the waiting game for the big games? And that's the fun part. Beyond the launch lineup and the fact that the PS2 may have been graphically a little less powerful than its eventual competition that we'll talk about in the next video, Sony managed to put itself in a successful position with the PS2 early on with two big giant things. The first thing was backwards compatibility. The PS2 was fully backwards compatible with the PlayStation 1, which meant that all of your games, controllers, and memory cards would work on the PS2 no problem. The PS1 wasn't actually the first console to do backwards compatibility because the Atari 7800 was able to do it, but yeah, you'd have a better chance selling someone a Pyramid Scheme than an Atari 7800. And yeah, the Game Boy Color could play Game Boy games, so there's that too. But the PS2 was the first system that really did backwards compatibility in the home console market that people actually wanted to buy. Having a system people actually were looking forward to that could play older games was a big deal, as was the fact that the PS2 also doubled as a DVD player. This wasn't the first time that a console was really dipping into the multimedia market, because the PS1 had like a CD player type thing, but the PS2 was also a DVD player, and that was a pretty big deal in 2000 because the DVD format was becoming a pretty huge thing. I know nowadays some people might take that for granted with the advent of streaming and digital purchases and things like that, but DVDs were becoming a huge deal, and everyone wanted to get in on DVDs. But back in 2000, DVD players were hella expensive. From my research, I found that the DVD players of 2000 were initially going for as cheap as $600 and as expensive as $1,000. So yeah, just a little bit of money. Obviously, those prices would become controlled, sure. But when the PS2 came out, it was a $300 console that also had a DVD player in it, and was a good entry point for those who wanted to start watching DVDs, with the added benefit of it being a video game console. That, again, as I just mentioned, happened to be a huge quantum leap forward for multimedia support in video game consoles. Nowadays, again, it's easy to take that for granted because you can fire up your PS5 or Series X and watch Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus or whatever streaming service, blah, blah, blah. But back then, it was a pretty big deal that you could watch DVDs on your PS2. And then, yeah, as we will talk about in the next few videos in the series, the PS2's lineup would become pretty awesome. Maybe not right away, but eventually it would become awesome. So intro out of the way, on to the actual games of 2000. Again, there's not many, which is why I'm glad that I have things where I talk about the snubs or the just missed the cut kind of games, because it gives me a little more to talk about. And there were some notable games from 2000 that I didn't play or didn't play enough of. The four big ones that I could find that were huge in 2000 that I don't have much experience with were Deus Ex, Diablo 2, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which I've only played a little bit of, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, although I did technically play that in a different form later on, but we'll save that for the appropriate video. But even with the lack of great games, there were still some pretty good ones that just missed the cut. Again, with the just missed the cut section of these videos, I like to talk about games that would, on my scale, be like a 7 out of 10, and we got a couple here. The first of them that I can mention is Perfect Dark, which I have many times said my hot take on Rare's Nintendo 64 output. I know it's considered to be a big source of nostalgia for a lot of people, but I think much of the games that Rare has put out on the N64 have aged quite a bit. Be glad I did not talk about GoldenEye in the last video, because many of you probably would not have liked what I had to say about GoldenEye. Perfect Dark, though, is an improvement over GoldenEye. It kind of works within a lot of the same formula, but it makes some changes here and there. Though there are still some elements to it that are frustrating to me, like the overwhelming level design and the whole you have to beat every level objective in one go kind of thing. I personally find that a little bit annoying, but it is still a pretty enjoyable game. And another game that I think was pretty enjoyable that didn't quite make the list was Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards. For a long time, this was the as good as it gets of Kirby games on consoles, especially given that it took so long for another proper mainline Kirby game to come to consoles. Much like Yoshi's Story, which I mentioned in the last video, this felt a little safe to me, but it was still a fun, charming 2.5D platformer to unwind to if you were looking for something kind of quick and light. And in the last video, I mentioned being a licensed game apologist, and I showed a couple PS1 games that I used to play a lot as a kid that I still really enjoy. And wouldn't you know it, I got one more to show. This one right here. Which actually, if you didn't notice, you won't notice till I tell you, but the box is broken. This is a copy that I actually just recently got of the game around 2020, and the box is wonky. Obviously, I no longer have the copy I had as a kid, but at least I have a disc-based copy of it. But yes, Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue on the PS1. I grew up a huge Power Rangers kid, and this was a game that obviously doesn't reinvent the wheel. Of course, it's a licensed game, and it is wonky in a lot of ways, but much like Rugrats Studio Tour and Toy Story 2 Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue, which I talked about in the last video, this game holds a lot of cherished childhood memories for me, and it's still a game that I enjoy going back to every now and again. It's actually a rather fun 3D beat-em-up that you can get through pretty quickly, even if it's not the most spectacular thing that you'll ever play. Though on the flip side, I will mention that I think the Nintendo 64 version of the game is the worst game that I've ever played and beaten. So make of that what you will. But anyway, now we're going to get on to the proper list, the cream before the crop games. The games that came out in the year 2000 that I would consider like an 8 or 9 out of 10. Again, we only have 2. This is a pretty short video. I didn't want to dilly-dally and just constantly blabber nonsense, but obviously the video needed some kind of length. But either way, these next 2 games I'm going to talk about are games I still really enjoy, so let's get into them. The first of the 2 cream before the crop games from 2000. One that may be a little surprising to some, but it's another one that I have a lot of fondness towards, that I've played a lot of. I really love me some Pokemon Stadium. Even though I didn't really own a Nintendo 64 for very long, I played Pokemon Stadium a lot with family and friends, and it's a game I still really enjoy to this day. I know people complain about having to use rental Pokemon in the game because the rental Pokemon aren't actually that great. And yeah, sure, to some people it's one of those games where it's not really fun to play unless you have an older Pokemon game that you can transfer your own Pokemon into, but I don't give a damn, I'll take the rentals, I just love the game. The 3D battling is great, the animations are super charming, and I absolutely love the announcer. He's super funny and over the top. Just to give an anecdote, there's a part in the game where if you use Magikarp and you use Splash, the announcer gets really exacerbated and over the top and just goes, "What's the point of splashing?" It's genuinely one of the funniest things I've experienced in a Pokemon game ever. It makes me laugh every time. And also, the mini-games in this game are among some of the greatest things ever created, point blank period, and sometimes I like to go back to Pokemon Stadium for the mini-games alone. In a way, this game was kind of a nice middle ground for Pokemon fans since the mainline games weren't on consoles, so it was a pretty good little as close as you'll get kind of thing to having a mainline Pokemon game with actual battling on a console. And with what we have today from Pokemon, it might seem a bit pointless to go back to something like this, but to me, it's still a really enjoyable game that I love going back to for its simple, joyous fun, and I wish the Pokemon Company or someone involved actually remembered the existence of the minigames once in a while. Seriously, just bring those back. They were super fun. And then the only other cream before the crop game I have listed here is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, a game that had one of the most dangerous tasks in all of gaming history, being the follow-up to The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, a game that is widely hailed by many even to this day as perhaps the greatest video game ever created. It was going to be hard to top Ocarina of Time, though I know for some people it actually did. I know quite a few people who actually like Majora better than Ocarina. And for me personally, it didn't quite top Ocarina, but did it really have to? All Majora's Mask needed to do for me was be a great game, and that it was. Even despite using a lot of the pre-established content and features of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask shows how good Nintendo is at continuing to iterate and create fresh experiences through familiar territory with a ton of new changes. The mask system adds some new layers to the gameplay, the time-based feature is interesting even if it can be pretty stressful to deal with, and the writing is some of the creepiest and darkest stuff Nintendo has done to date. Compared to the grand epic coming-of-age tale that was Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask feels like it has a sense of quiet sadness and melancholia to it that I find really fascinating. Even if it's built around a lot of what Ocarina of Time was built around, Majora stands as an interesting little experimental game of sorts for Nintendo, and it's definitely well worth your time if you haven't played it already. I didn't mention this with Ocarina in the last video, but with Ocarina and Majora, if you're going to play them today, I definitely recommend playing the 3DS re-releases that came out a few years back. Well, actually, it's more than a few years back. Majora's Mask 3D turns 10 next year. What the fuck? But there's still one game from 2000 that tops all of them. The one game from that year that I gave a 10 out of 10 to. I alluded to this game in the last video, and quite frankly, you should know that it's going to be in this video. It shouldn't come as any surprise at all. But my favorite game of 2000, by far, gotta give it to Spyro Year of the Dragon. Again, you had to know it was going to be here in some way. Weirdly enough, as a kid, Spyro Year of the Dragon was my first Spyro game. I don't know why I got the games out of order, but either way, it's a video game I've played the crap out of, and it's still one of my top 10 favorite video games of all time. Across the board, it was by far the most polished entry in the entire Spyro series, taking everything that the first two games, especially 2, had done well, and pretty much cleaning them up to near perfection. What's more, they were able to add a lot of variation and new styles to the gameplay without taking away from the base game's identity, which made it an absolute joy to play. The level design is without question some of my favorite in the Spyro series, the visual design is still beautiful to this day, and the music is definitely some of the best the series has come through with, and some of my personal favorite stuff in gaming. I mentioned it in the last video, but Stuart Copeland from The Police did the soundtrack for the Spyro trilogy, and what an unbelievable job that he did. In my eyes, forget never being topped. The Spyro franchise has honestly never even come close to Year of the Dragon since its release. Obviously, many of you know it if you followed Spyro, and also Crash Bandicoot because he's kind of aligned with Spyro, but these franchises took a big downturn after the initial PS1 trilogies, and at least in Crash's case, he's had a game or two that I could say have lived up to the original trilogy. Spyro, I can't even fully say has done that, at least not in his own series. I don't think any Spyro game that's come out since Year of the Dragon has approached it, in my opinion. Beyond being one of the most important games in my own personal life, it's just a magical game that's still incredible to play to this day, and it's one I feel like everyone should play at some point. Whether that's through the original version or through the Insane Trilogy re-release, both of them are great. I truly hope we get another Spyro game sometime in the future, and hopefully that game that Toys for Bob is working on, that's been rumored to be a new Spyro game, actually turns out to be a new Spyro game, because I feel like they could do something really great with that. So yeah, that's the video. I know, pretty short one this time. I wish there were more games to talk about from 2000, but sadly, this is the best I got. Pretty slow year. Some very noteworthy games. Again, Spyro Year of the Dragon is one of the most important games to me personally, but yeah, it was a pretty light one this time around. Have no fear though, because the video on 2000 is going to be much more packed than this one. But of course, this is just my opinion on the year 2000 in gaming. What do you guys think of it? Are there more games that I missed out from 2000 that you really enjoyed? Are there games I did mention that you enjoyed just as much? Do you also agree that 2000 was kind of a slow year for gaming? And since the big topic of this video was the PlayStation 2, did you get a PS2 back in 2000? Again, when the PS2 came out, I was 2 years old, so I don't really have any memory of its launch or anything like that. So for those of you who may have memories with it early in its life, tell me about them. What are some of your fondest memories with the PS2? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. And yeah, like I said, the next video I'm going to be talking about my favorite games of 2001. And that one is going to have far more than what this video had, because the combination of having a bunch of games to talk about and having two brand new consoles that came out in 2001 is going to make that video pretty exciting. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.